Sure. Thanks for having me, Kaushik. It's quite an honor to be your first. I'm really excited about what AntWork is planning on doing. This is really great stuff. I got into security way back in 1995. I had started an ISP, and before that, I had a whole career as an automotive engineer. But I started my ISP and then transitioned to a competitor that was doing security, and they were essentially a reseller for Checkpoint and Cisco, and ultimately ISS as well. And they were the first MSSP that provided secure connections to the internet. And that company, Netrex, was acquired ultimately by ISS, which was a public company that then sold to IBM. So it's still actually part of IBM's managed security services. So in the meantime, I moved on to PricewaterhouseCoopers, and that's where I got my exposure to large enterprise security by doing security audits, pen testing, for lack of a better term. But back then it included, archaic things like war dialing and hacking the phone systems, as well as attacks against websites at Dell Computer, for instance, that's successful at getting through. From there, I was recruited by Gartner. That's kind of where my career as an industry analyst took off. And belatedly, after I left Gartner, I realized that the only thing I'm actually cut out to do effectively and enjoy doing is being an industry analyst. So I started my own firm, IT Harvest. As part of that, realize, hey, if you're on your own and you're, essentially an independent, kind of like a consultant, you should write a book. So I started writing books, and now I've written 10, of which the latest, Security Yearbook 2023, is behind me. And it's, I've never looked back. I think security is probably the only industry that can capture my attention and keep me enthused over 25 years because it's constantly changing. There's new players, there's new threat actors, there's brand new technologies that come along that are not secure to begin and eventually have to be secured. That's where cloud came into play, and IoT, and now artificial intelligence, just game-changing technologies that are changing the world we live in, all of which are going to introduce new security issues that have to be addressed. So that's where we're at today.
Awesome.
Or, you can always look at trends from two different directions. One, trends on the attacker side, and then trends on the defense side. And on the attacker side, the advent, really the thing that made our current day's problem possible was the creation of Bitcoin. I think it came out in January of 2008. In 2009, there was effective implementation of Bitcoin, and it was not possible to anonymously transfer money around the internet. And up till then, cybercrime or cyber criminals that would do extortion for DDoS attacks would ask people to use, wire transfers to send money around. And of course, that would leave a money trail that the FBI or law enforcement could track down and try and get these guys. But with completely anonymous transactions through Bitcoin, ransomware became possible. And so that became the current scourge of the internet because it's the easiest for the bad guys to monetize. And it's still with us, of course. Now the trend from there, because, we'd already been through the massive waves of very sophisticated attackers targeting very large companies, banks, of course, being on the cutting edge there. So by the time ransomware came around, banks were already well defended against simplistic attacks that come through click on a link, through a phishing attack, and then download malware and get infected and encrypted, which is what ransomware is. Not a big problem for banks. But what's happened is that ransomware has democratized victimhood in the cyberspace because everybody can be subject to ransomware attacks. And that has caused we're in the era we're in now, where it's become evident that smaller organizations are extremely vulnerable. They used to be able to get away with saying, oh, we're not a target for those nasty hackers in Russia. But now you are, and only because you're vulnerable, and they can attack you and succeed and demand a ransom from you. So even, small savings and loans and manufacturers and state and local agencies have been effectively attacked and shut down for long term. As a matter of fact, when this book was going to press last year, my printer got attacked by ransomware, and they had to shut down for 3 weeks, delaying the production of Security Yearbook 2022. So that's been the overall trend. Now, right now, we're entering a new era. We're getting kind of, for once, we can now see, we can predict the future. When there's a new technology, enough pundits out there predict how it good and bad, that it's pretty easy to predict that, yeah, artificial intelligence will, in large language models like ChatGPT and Bard, will be used to craft, extremely good phishing attacks. No problem. Generative AI will be used to make those even better or more disruptive with deep fakes. So you could have, a country leader announcing some horrible thing, and everybody would fall for it for a short time anyways. And so that's now possible. Banking fraud or mortgage fraud with cloned voices, so people actually call up and trying to convince a bank to release passwords or something like that. All that's going to be possible, and we're just entering that era now. But we're also, still in an era where attacks against cloud infrastructure are rampant. And bad guys are discovering that most data is transmitted via APIs. So let's attack those. They're horribly protected. And APIs, protected by a long user key. So username and password, and back there all over again. So that's the fun part about this industry. There's always something going on. Yeah, when I joined Gartner, they brought me on because Gartner had a single industry analyst covering security. That was John Pescatori, and his call backlog was stretched out to 3 months. So if a Gartner client wanted to talk about security, it would take 3 months to get on John Pescatori's calendar. So they needed to hire a second analyst. So they hired me. Within 2 weeks of joining, my backlog was 3 months long, so basically it was like huge demand for security at the time. And I remember John telling me, security will never be the next big thing, but it will always be part of the next big thing. And that has played out, right? Security was part of the expansion into cloud. It was part of the expansion into smart devices, IoT. The next big thing is space, so security is a part of that.
Awesome.
Frameworks are valuable because it gives a common structure that people can use to organize around. In some sense, it makes it easier to be audited, right? So an auditor will come in and go, okay, hey, you're following a framework, be it NIST, or it might be even aligned with MITRE ATT&CK. It could be an ISO standard that you're following. And it gives the auditor something to check, because auditors are definitely checking the boxes, right? Just to make sure that here's a set of guidelines, embedded in the framework, and you are following them. And we're going to check your controls that you've deployed. But it is definitely, because every organization is under attack from different directions, the frameworks aren't going to provide any sort of defense against the actual attacks. And that is more of how, I do like to use military metaphors. So every country generally has a structure to its military. You might have branches for Army, Navy, Air Force, space now. And within that, it's got a hierarchy, so everybody in the military can understand where they are in this hierarchy. But when you go to a battle, there's a big difference between, the colonel who's back in headquarters organizing logistics and the colonel who's, on the front line commanding several battalions who are responding in real time to the attacker. And that's the way it is in security, right? So your framework is there to, make sure you got the right departments in place, people in place, reporting structure in place. But, this evening, it's an attacker from, North Korea who's decided that they need some military secret from you that they're going to sell on to China. And they're devoting 24/7 in order to get that. So you're in a real-time situation, and your framework doesn't help you in that situation at all, right? You've got to monitor what's happening on your network, make, lightning fast decisions about how to respond and try and ward off the attacker.
Brilliant.
Well, it's really tough, right? So there are, if you haven't suffered an attack, then you can, look at the Ponemon Institute's study, several other large, Verizon attack study, and they try and quantify the cost. But I think the best approach is scenario planning, and it's a little bit like a tabletop exercise. But you say, okay, hey, here's our business, and our business is, it might be, selling furniture. And we've digitized it to the extent that 40% of our sales actually come from our website or, a channel through Amazon that we use. And therefore, that's our attack surface, right? So what happens if either ransomware or a DDoS attack, different levels of attack, reduce our ability to take orders for our product and we can't ship them. Or, another attack against our OT system messes with our manufacturing equipment or with our supply chain. We're having all those products built in Vietnam and they attack the supply chain or the shipping that gets them here, some disruption to our ability to produce. What does that cost us? So now you've got a concrete cost associated with succumbing to a cyber attack, and you can line up, well, how do we, we've just postulated what that attack would do. How does it do it? And how can we stop it from ever happening? And that kind of lays out your investments in security that you need to prevent those future losses. My favorite example is Lockheed Martin. So if you remember back to 2007, 2008 timeframe, the defense industrial base suffered a major breach. And the only evidence we had at the time eventually were people talking to Ellen Nakashima at the Washington Post and revealing that the top 10 weapon systems that the United States military has were completely stolen. The designs, the communications about the designs, everything, 20 terabytes of data. And that included the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, THAAD anti-missile system, all of our most sophisticated weapon systems. China evidently had completely stolen the designs to them, probably including source code for the software that runs on them as well. The NSA and the Department of Defense went to the defense industrial base and told them, what had gone on, and everybody, dropped everything and improved their security. And of course, Lockheed Martin, manufacturer of many of those advanced weapon systems, upped their game to the point where they could counter these attacks that they're under. So these are targeted attacks. They're not ransomware-like because those are pretty simplistic. So sophisticated, for instance, that there's an attack on their supply chain, their security supply chain, which was the secure ID tokens that every employee at Lockheed used to get connected to the corporate network, 80,000 employees. And, these are probably the most studied authentication tokens ever. People had written papers, for their doctorates on how to, crack and discover the secret seed that was in those tokens so you could spoof them and mimic them and break into a system. And don't forget, the tokens are essentially synced with a clock, and they're generating random 10-digit codes, and the servers got the same codes because it's got the same secret seed for each token, so it can generate those. So extremely difficult to break in. And you could throw those tokens in a microwave and extract some data from it. You can etch the silicon with acid and discover some things, but you tend to destroy the token. So the secret seeds are actually the crown jewels. They are, say, Secure ID company. And they did not do a good job of protecting the crown jewels. A group of Chinese hackers broke in over a period of weeks and stole the tokens, the secret seeds for all the tokens that were out there. And within a month had attacked Lockheed Martin and attempted to log in with false credentials. Lockheed Martin saw them trying to break in and shut down remote access for all their employees. That's when I was like, wow, how did they do that? That's a really sophisticated attack. Usually you're, even today with zero trust, you'd say, I don't trust anybody unless they got a secure token. Well, the attacker had a secure token and had logged in, using that token. What would make you suspicious about that? Well, Lockheed Martin had developed a method of tracking the attacker's activities. And so they knew all about them. And they had, there's like a signature for their activity. Time of day, is it business hours in Beijing? Types of exploits they like to use. And something in the login, either the geolocation or the time of day or something, triggered them to realize this was an attack, and they shut it down. So yeah, completely possible to defend against these sophisticated attacks. It isn't easy. It's expensive. But the damages warrant the expense. fiber as everybody else's data, but it was set aside for you, and it was supposedly multi-protocol, but frankly was pure IP, internet protocol, TCP/IP. And that was just the way it worked. And then you would put gateways at your corporate headquarters between that extended corporate network. It was all tied together. That gateway would protect you from the internet. And that's how I got into the business, selling checkpoint firewalls to Ford Motor and ITT Automotive to do just that. The TACOM, Tank Automotive Command here in Warren, Michigan, which creates the M1A1 Abrams tanks. Sold them their first firewall too, which, by the way, an aside, took them years to implement a rule that wasn't allow all, just because it's so hard. Even though you've got the technology, it's so hard to get the buy-in to actually block things inside the military. Yeah, so fast forward to the introduction of 5G. Now, internet connectivity is on our phone, and it's very easy to tether your laptop, whatever. So if you're in the office and you're not happy with the internet throughput, that your company has provided, you're just going to get on your 5G network, completely bypassing the firewalls, the secure web gateways, all the controls that they put in place to prevent attackers from getting in the network. So that had a dramatic effect. It's given rise to SASE, sometimes called Secure Service Edge, but companies like Zscaler, Cato, Netscope, Perimeter 81, who are basically large proxy services in the cloud. And they're the modern ISP, but it's riding over the internet connectivity you get through your 5G or your landlines, etc. And they apply all the controls. So that's given rise to a brand new category of security companies service. And it's going to be, it's the death knell for the firewall appliance, right? It's like, well, I don't need a firewall appliance on my phone, so why do I need one in my home office or in my corporate network at all? Because I'm just going to connect to these proxies and then be secure. And I can, those large organizations like Zscaler can apply a lot more power and bandwidth and security know-how to protecting you than you'll ever be able to do. So that huge dramatic change that we're living through right now. Artificial intelligence, early days, but I can tell you, the most exciting thing up till now that had happened in my purview of the technology space was the introduction of the internet. And back then there were when I got on the internet, there were fewer than 1 million people using the internet. Now there are 3.5 billion people using the internet every single day. The thing that was super exciting, right? Changed my life, got me into networking and out of automotive engineering. The advent of ChatGPT, earlier in 2023, I think ushered in the most exciting technological change that we've ever seen. It's going to totally disrupt everything in our lives. And I think people should be prepared for that. I think it'll be, primarily good, but obviously the bad guys take advantage of any new technology, and they will definitely be doing that. But the good is going to far outweigh the bad. Yeah, you talked about digitization, and this goes way back to the introduction of the internet, right? People, especially here in the United States, just jumped on the internet willy-nilly and started to, make money, improve productivity, etc., and totally ignored the security aspects that they had to also invest in security. So, they might have gone 10, 15 years without spending on security as much as they should before a breach. And the breach, of course, costs much more than anything they ever would have spent on security. So basically, you're accumulating security debt along the way, right? You're expending on technology, you're becoming citizen of the digital world, and your customers are all online, and you're not investing. So you've already underspent on security for many years, and you're very lucky that you haven't had a breach. Guaranteed, if you're the CISO, or you or your successor will have all the budget in the world after a breach, right? Because it's in the public, the SEC's involved, you're being fined, costs you your job, and the new person is going to come in and, of course, negotiate the budgets that they need. Now, in the meantime, do not let the CTO, people on the business side, embark on any endeavor without baking in the cost of securing that endeavor. So that's where you get your budget. They have to realize when they're calculating their return on investment on launching a new product and a new website and a new technical whatever, the part of their ROI calculation has to include the investment in security to reduce the risks associated with the new exposure you're introducing. So it's not hey, here's just a new expense we're going to tack on. In other words, the money has already come in and is trickled all the way down to the bottom line, and you're going to reduce the bottom line because you're spending on security. Don't let that happen. Make sure it's part of the cost of goods sold, essentially, at the beginning. It's kind of a different way of shifting left, shift the left of income production by making sure you're an expense that's associated with production, not an expense associated with, paying down a risk at the end of the game. I think it's funny, but the investment world, on the private side, seems to follow and lag the public markets. So when good money follows good returns, and when a few companies like CrowdStrike, Fortinet, Palo Alto Networks, Zscaler just had phenomenal Wall Street returns happening in 2020 and 2021 and into early 2022, it was just, they were just skyrocketing, right? Super high valuations, super high multiples of stock price, of earnings, sometimes negative earnings, so infinite multiples. So that just fuels the interest on the part of new investors. Hey, wow, I want to be an investor in the next Zscaler, or the next company to go public or sold. And they, it's just a track record. It's been very successful for many VCs and private equity companies. So active interest and always new companies getting into it. So, so that's kind of the motivation, right? There's outsized returns possible. So let's find a company. When I talk to investors, they are really, really swayed by investing in people who have done it before. So serial entrepreneurs. Think of the founder of Transmit Security. He came from, a successful sale of a previous company to IBM. And when he finally came out and said, we're going to raise some money, he raised a round of something like $586 million. Biggest A round in the history of cybersecurity anyways. And it's because he's had a track record. He made money for investors in the past. But the other thing is, they're looking for an idea that will disrupt an existing market or create a new category of market. And they tend to move around in their interest level of market. And this year, for instance, identity and access management is getting a lot of attention. People are very interested in it. We're on track this year of seeing $10 billion of venture capital put into cybersecurity companies, most of them startups. So far this year, in the first 3 quarters, 224 companies have taken in funding. And this is during a year that we thought there was a recession, and Silicon Valley Bank in February this year completely failed. And so all the investors' money was tied up in a bank over a weekend anyways, until they were sure that it was going to be safe. So it made them even more cautious than normal. And yet, total investment looks like it's going to be on track to be the same as 2020, which in 2020 was a complete record, right? 2019 was about 7 billion. 2020 was 10 billion. It was only the next years that we saw that crazy, 24 billion investment in 1 year. And now, of course, last year it dropped 17 billion, and then this year's. The biggest market dynamic is what I call digital mercantilism. So you remember mercantilism is, I think it's actually a 19th century concept of, hey, we're going to make our country stronger by protecting, manufacturing in our country by imposing tariffs on things manufactured somewhere else, right? And that goes on today. It's a horrible thing. We attempt to stop that with a world market and free trade, etc., but it still goes on, obviously. Speaking from personal experience, I have books returned to me every day because somebody didn't pay the import duty on books. There are countries that are limiting knowledge being shipped into them, and that includes Denmark, the Netherlands, India, the list goes on. Why would you impose taxes on books? That said, in the digital world, it's taken the form of distrust. And so countries are sowing distrust of technology based on the origin country they come from. And obviously the United States and Britain are the primary culprits, right? They're trying to paint all Chinese technology as untrustworthy. So you shouldn't buy from Huawei, you should buy from our companies, right? Cisco in the United States. But that goes two ways, right? And Edward Snowden caused a very, very broad breach, I guess, in trust of U.S. technology. Especially in Europe. And in Europe, especially in Germany. German customers don't trust U.S. technology because there's a perception that the NSA is spying on all of your stuff. So that gives rise to a buy local mentality. Even though I would argue, as awful as it is for intelligence agencies to spy on people, would you rather have your intelligence agency spying on you or your adversary's intelligence agency spying on you? Because frankly, China can't come knocking on the door and arrest me for what I'm thinking. But, your own country's intelligence or law enforcement can. In some countries, they do that. And that aside, it's given rise to more cybersecurity companies. So that's why when people say, the industry's got to consolidate and there'll only be 5 big vendors, I go, no, not true at all. Because, if it's like the rest of technology where the big vendors are US based, all the FANG, for instance, then the rest of the world's not going to put up with that, right? That's too much power in the grasp of the US. So you're going to have firewall vendors and identity vendors and endpoint security vendors in every country in the world at some point. And that just means, my job will never be done because I'm trying to categorize all the vendors in the world. I count 3,622 today, but I've got a backlog of ones to categorize. Architectures. Okay. For sure, enterprises should copy each other, right? Learn from each other and what they found effective. And the great thing is, even though most, competitors, won't talk with each other, the CISOs from competing companies can talk to each other, right? They're not part of the business. They're part of the protection of the business, and therefore they can talk. I think even today, the best defense is a layered defense. I can't shake that way of thinking. So you think about, obviously you got to think about what you're protecting, the crown jewels. Trouble is the crown jewels, means something different to everybody. But what is it about your business that is core to the business being successful, your competitive advantage, things that your business people probably understand, but they have to translate that into understanding for the IT people. Once you decide that, then you figure out how to make sure it's encrypted all the time, no matter where it is. It's got to be encrypted. Come on, encrypting is the simplest and least expensive solution. Now, the expensive part of encrypting is managing keys. So do a really good job of that. Do not ever put keys in Active Directory. Active Directory is already the target for every attacker. Do not put your encryption keys in Active Directory. Just don't do that. If you look at the proper way to maintain encryption keys, you're storing them as signing keys in a hardware security module. And it's in a separate room that you can't get to it and you can't re-sign or do any changes to it without 2 people present, right? It's that level of security around your data. And then, of course, you still got the constant attacks at the periphery that are going to be the ransomware and business email compromise kinds of attacks. And, you look at those as almost a second tier of concern, but one that's important because that's what causes all the help desk calls. So you tackle that next. But start with the data, think about the servers and endpoints that the data resides on, think about the network that they're on, and pretty soon you've got a pretty good architecture. A really good example is how do you stop spear phishing? So I know for a while, in the early days, companies just said no email, with the internet. We're just not going to allow it. Well, that obviously doesn't work. Today, it's a strange concept that you have to train people to be your first line of defense. In other words, train people not to click on links when they come in through email. I think that's ridiculous. You can never train that well. It's just never going to happen. The very, very best anti-phishing training schemes claim they can get their success rate up to 98%. Well, if 2% of phishing attacks succeed, then an attacker only has to send 50 emails to get in with any campaign. That's nothing. It costs them 0 cents to do that. So in other words, instead of causing people pain by constantly berating them, putting them up on a wall of shame for clicking on links, just make it impossible for clicking on a link to cause damage. And you do that through sandboxing, blocking clicking on links altogether, using remote browsers, that can't get infected and can't do any damage if you do click on a link. All sorts of solutions. And I think that's kind of the approach you always have to take. If there's plenty of technology, right? There's over 3,000 companies that have developed that technology. Deploy that technology to get around so you don't rely on the good behavior or smartness or intelligence of your end user. Well, I'm somewhat of a hypocrite here because, frankly, all my books and all my public speaking is helping to make people aware, right? And yet I don't think of security awareness as doesn't have a place anywhere in defense in depth. Now, mind you, security practitioners should be very knowledgeable and constantly learning and exploring and understanding the attacker methodologies, etc., right? But I do not believe the person on the assembly line, the office worker, the receptionist has to be trained or has to even be aware that Security Awareness Month is in progress. It's kind of Security Awareness Month is a great time for everybody to rally together in the industry, but we're just talking to ourselves in an echo chamber. I don't think it has any impact whatsoever on the overall state of defense. We've had it actually. I found an article I wrote about Security Awareness Month in 2008 for Network World. So that's 15 years that it's been around, at least. And in the past 15 years, every year, security is a bigger issue. So obviously, this month of encouraging people to not click on things hasn't worked. So I'm of the mind that we should retire Security Awareness Month altogether. It served its purpose. Now it's just a reason for, more slogans from the government and from vendors. And, let's just move on and get